boy went to say goodbye to his mom. Then he says this, and they quickly stop the funeral. During his mother's funeral, a little boy discovers something odd about her body. After telling the people nearby, things started moving quickly. When the funeral is called off, what happens next is right out of a mystery novel. On a gloomy Tuesday in Dallas, the sky broke under the constant downpour that cast a pall over the city. There was a lot of people at the funeral parlor. They had come to comfort Tony from all over the town. He was filled with great grief that he didn't know how to handle. The 12-year-old simply gripped his uncle's hand hard since he was out of tears. They made their way through a sea of sorrow together. When they arrived at the open coffin, Tony's eyes remained red and scratchy. He was about to return to his grief as he looked into his mother's peaceful face when he noticed something strange. His uncle saw right away and asked the youngster, bending down to his level, what was wrong. Tony didn't pay much attention as he tried to hear his uncle whisper over the noise of the crowd. His mother's hands were neatly crossed across her chest, yet there was an emptiness there. They'd been playing around in the kitchen a few years ago as she was making dinner. She got injured on the outside of her thumb by a slipping knife. It left a strange-looking scar, but it had healed nicely. Her hand no longer had that scar. It didn't make sense to him that the funeral parlor would try to cover up such a scar, even though he knew they would have used a ton of makeup when getting the body ready for the funeral. His uncle asked him again about the matter. Tony felt his heart quicken. He had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. He said in a whisper, "It's gone." Tony's meaning wasn't fully clear to his uncle. He drew the child aside and gave him his word that all would be well. He was aware that the appearance of the dead can occasionally differ from what their loved ones recall. However, Tony was the only one who truly knew his mother. Every aspect of her life, every story she shared, every feeling she experienced, he was familiar with all of them. He took another look at the coffin. Even though the woman reminded him of his mother, the longer he looked, the more he thought this couldn't be her. The boy didn't know how to tell other people about that. Uncle Mike guided him away from the coffin by holding him by the elbow. Tony followed instructions, but he wasn't persuaded. He could not shake the sight of his mother's hand without the scar. He was not, as everyone seemed to be telling him, just a heartbroken little boy. What he knew was shocking. 3 days remained until the funeral, and he was determined not to allow them to bury a lady who was not his mother. Tony was gone as soon as the adults began talking with one another. After making sure no one was watching, he went down a hallway to the funeral home's rear offices. He'd read detective novels long enough to know that records are the first place to go when opening an investigation. Even though he wasn't really sure what he was searching for or what records were, he knew he needed a place to start from his favorite investigator. For now, he was just going to wing it. It was silent in the room behind the reception area. File cabinets surrounded the walls, and papers were scattered on the large desk in the center. "It's not like these people are terribly neat," he said to himself. Tony noticed that the tiny labels on the front of the cabinet drawers were arranged alphabetically. It was going to be simple, he believed. D for Dora, or J for Jackie. He would locate information about his mother in that file, in the filing cabinet with the J or D on it. After what seemed like an hour, Tony managed to locate his mother's file. It was a sleeve made of thick cardboard that held a stack of documents. Even so, he had something to work with, even if he was still unsure of what he was searching for. Now, he didn't grasp the majority of the papers. Yes, he could understand the words, but he was clueless as to their meaning. He returned the file to its original location, dejected. However, he saw the folder just in front of it when he was separating the hanging files in the cabinet to replace his mother's. The individual shared his mother's initials, JD. He extracted the file. Tony was intrigued. It did not take him long to realize that this was a file that belonged to a woman named Jane Doe. He understood what that implied. In his detective novels, people would refer to unidentified characters as John or Jane Doe. Tony felt his heart race. Upon examining the dates and times, he realized that this body had been delivered to the morgue just 10 minutes after his mother's, and no one had come forward to claim it. Tony thought this was a significant matter. Spreading Jane Doe's file open in front of him, Tony took a seat at the central desk in the records room. The woman matched his mother in every way. She weighed 120 lbs and stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. It might have been his mother on paper. She had blue eyes and black hair as well. Then his attention was drawn to something else. According to the paperwork, she was scar-free. Tony was more certain than ever that the missing scar held the secret to something greater as he returned to the funeral. It was not his mother who was in the coffin. She looked so much like Jackie Dorner that some people would be tricked, but he knew she wasn't. However, Tony also understood that without evidence, no one would ever believe him. So that evening, while laying in bed at Uncle Mike's, he made the decision to gather some. Tony searched his mind for anything unusual that he had witnessed or would recall. He suddenly realized that Jackie Dorner was a reputable investigative journalist. A few days before her passing, Tony recalled her speaking on the phone with someone. Tony asked Uncle Mike to drive him home the following morning. He desired to have a day with his mother's belongings. Tony immediately made his way up to the attic, and Uncle Mike dropped him off shortly after breakfast. His mother was employed here. It was also the only area of the house he was not allowed to enter, and where she stored all her documents. But extreme measures are necessary in these desperate circumstances. He found his mother's journal in less than 5 minutes. She had them organized in her desk's top drawer. There was another drawer with her notebooks. They had a plethora of names and notes that he was unable to comprehend. There was a folder with numerous printed emails underneath them. Tony gave them a short glance before swiftly reclining. He was afraid of the emails. They were menacing alerts to his mother to seize her inquiry. For the first time in many days, Tony smiled because of this. There was no way that would work. There was no one he knew who was braver than his mother. Jackie Dorner was not going to be scared into doing anything she did not want to do. After an hour, Tony headed to the kitchen to get a drink. He allowed his thoughts to wander as he gazed out the window. He cast another glance at his mother's hand in the coffin in his thoughts, and just as before, he was certain it wasn't hers. He suspected something was wrong based on what he had seen in his mother's notes and emails, but he didn't yet have proof to provide to the people. Nothing to persuade them he wasn't just another grieving young man. Then his mind glowed like a ukulele tree. He intended to visit Miss Henderson. She was an experienced reporter. That was the name his mother had given her, and she had always stated that seasoned journalists are known for their moral character. She didn't respond when he tried to call her. Next, he made the decision to ride his bicycle to her house from the garage. She opened the door and said, "Tony, what are you doing here?" He said he had to know about his mother's most recent task. Despite his demanding tone, he maintained the modesty his mother had taught him. Miss Henderson had a slight change. Glancing out the door, she gazed over his shoulder before pulling him inside after looking up and down the street. She put him down in the living room and handed him a glass of juice. She was plotting when she spoke once more. "Tony, your mother was right on the money. Something extremely hazardous. Why are you tampering with objects that you ought not to?" She did not await his response. She informed him that if she published her account, it would become a huge scandal involving high-level government corruption and damaged lives. Tony realized he had been correct all along, and frightening connections were beginning to emerge in his mind as Miss Henderson continued to speak. His mother was not in the coffin at the funeral home, so whatever had happened to her wasn't what it seemed. Perhaps someone fled in fear and attempted to silence her. She had told them tales of valiant journalists who had burnt their wings when they flew too close to the sun on a global scale. Perhaps she had experienced that. On his way home, Tony rode his bike madly and couldn't stop thinking. Like a bunny, leaping from one hole to the next, it appeared here, there, and almost everywhere. It seemed to him that he was more than just a bereaved son seeking closure. Oh no, he was now central to the plot to expose the lies that would destroy his mother's reputation, and he was going to fight for justice, just as she had done all her life. Uncle Mike was waiting for him in the driveway back home. After putting his bike away and mumbling an apology, Tony got inside the car. It would have to wait until tomorrow, but he knew what to do next. He was going to knock on the door of his mother's partner. The man went by Kieran Daniels. Tony was fond of him and knew him well. Who knew, maybe they might work together if he told Kieran what he was thinking and what he had discovered. Miss Henderson's and Kieran Daniels' responses to Tony's visit were quite similar. He spent some time expressing his sorrow at his mother's passing and was happy to see the kid. But Kieran got wary the moment Tony mentioned his mother's most recent investigation. Tony proceeded as methodically as he could. Tony explained his misgivings and the evidence he had gathered that seemed to confirm them. He set the menacing emails down on the coffee table in front of them and watched as Kieran's face became pale as he read them. Then Tony requested Kieran to assist him. "I can't expect anyone to accept my statement that the woman in the coffin isn't my mother." Reluctantly, he uttered, "I have one day left until the burial. By then, it will be too late." Kieran consented to assist. He shared part of their correspondence with Tony and talked to him about his mother's final actions. He then pulled out a flash disk. It contains security camera footage from the days leading up to Jackie's disappearance and so-called death, Kieran stated. Since he had gotten the video from the police department contact, it seemed likely that the authorities were also investigating a few other matters. In the first video, Tony's mother and an unidentified person had a heated meeting. 2 days later, on the second video, his mother was seen late at night leaving the office. She was holding a hefty packet under her left arm and had a worried expression on her face. Tony and Kieran assembled a chronology. Kieran then detonated a cluster bomb. What if Jackie had arranged her own disappearance to get out in front of whoever was threatening her, he asked. He extended an envelope towards Tony. "Your mother gave me this to give to you if anything ever happened to her," he stated. "I thought it wasn't worth giving to you, but if you say she's not in the coffin." Tony struggled with the letter with his fingers. He ripped up the envelope and read the note. "Honey, if you're reading this, I'm not safe," it stated. "I prepared for just such an occasion. Uncle Mike is going to look after you. I cherish you." Tony lost his wind after reading the note. First of all, hearing from his mother in this manner was unsettling. More significantly though, it strengthened his conviction that his mother might still be alive. Thirdly, it made the suspicion that Jackie Dorner was not the woman in the coffin. Saying, "I want to show you something," Kieran spoke. Reaching for his car keys, he motioned for Tony to follow. They left town after traveling a short distance and making several turns. Kieran turned around and drove back the way he had come for a few miles later. He informed Tony he was checking to make sure that they weren't being followed. After 30 minutes, they came to a halt at a modest suburban Dallas home. "This is a house a few of the journalists used when a story is about to break," he stated. "A sort of safe house." They knocked on the doors after circumvestigating the residence. Nothing. The curtains were drawn and there was no sign of recent tenants. The property felt very much unlived in and the trash bins were empty. It led nowhere. Tony thought he was going to cry. He had not found any concrete proof that his mother was still alive or that the woman in the coffin was not Jackie Dorner and the burial was tomorrow. Though it appeared that he had no choice, he wasn't prepared to give up. "You gave it your all, young one. I'll continue searching," Kieran assured Tony as he mounted his bike and rode away. Tony was broken when he arrived at the burial the following afternoon. He'd listened to his mother's final voice notes numerous times in the car on the way to the grave. More than anything, he wanted to know the truth and was so desperate to be near her at this moment. If he didn't know the truth, her passing would always haunt him. Tony stood rigidly next to the open grave later. As the graveside service drew to a finish and mourners sang a final, drawn-out hymn, he couldn't help but think of all the secrets that were being buried along with the coffin as he watched it being lowered into the ground. Tony was led forward by Uncle Mike, who grabbed him by the elbow. He then picked up some dirt in his hand and motioned for him to follow suit. Tony's phone buzzed in his pocket as his uncle tossed his fistful upon the coffin to mark a final farewell. He felt compelled to read the message before proceeding. His pulse skipped a beat as he looked at the screen. The sender of the message was not identified. It was an image. There was a woman's hand inside, and there was a notable scar on the side. More importantly, the hand held between its fingers a newspaper that contained today's date. Time paused. Everything vanished, including the coffin, Uncle Mike, the priest, the weeping relatives, and the open grave. It had not been a fruitless quest. Tony tugged at Uncle Mike's arm, revealing the photo to him. The first policeman showed just a few minutes after the ceremony was shortly stopped without any explanation. The burial was marked out, and the thorough inquiry was launched. Tony found this to be a bit muddled. The hunt for the truth was far from ended, but it had entered the home stretch, with the winning posts just around the corner. Jackie Dorner was discovered by investigators in a rundown home a few miles outside of Dallas 2 weeks later. She was thin and filthy, but she was still alive. Since her disappearance, she had been imprisoned with the expectation that she would be used as a negotiating chip once the piece she was working on was ready for publication. The corrupt syndicate that had infiltrated the federal administration was quickly apprehended and allowed to escape. After identifying the Jane Doe in the coffin, her family ran a funeral. Jackie and Tony curled up on the couch after everything had settled, and they had spent their first night together at their home in a very long time. There were tears, and once again, the most important thing to both of them was the remarkable link between mother and son.